Good morning, U.S. history classes. It is April 15th, Wednesday. Normally, this is tax day, but tax day has been officially pushed back because of the coronavirus and the economic shutdown this year to July 15th. So you probably won't see your parents stressing out as much today as you normally would on tax day, trying to get things completed before the deadline. Anyway, we are continuing today our discussion of the civil rights era. Uh, we've talked a little bit about the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which officially wrote into law the desegregation, the integration of American public schools. This was in the 1950s, and it really demonstrates the fact that the people who were working on dismantling Jim Crow and segregation really had to work in kind of a piecemeal fashion, had to work on integrating this part of American society and then this part of American society. And we know that Harry Truman desegregated the military first in the late 1940s. And because of that, the American military has become one of the most integrated parts of American society. But then, so the civil rights workers and lawyers then set to work on education. We know that with Brown versus Board of Education, they desegregated the public schools, at least in law. And we're going to talk some more about the backlash to that. Then they went to work on desegregating public transit, buses, city buses, worked on restaurants. This is with the lunch counter sit-ins and things of that nature. And then finally for today, we're going to talk about the Freedom Riders in 1961 who were working on desegregating interstate transit systems like Greyhound buses and things like that. So with Brown versus Board of Education, we have American law now saying American school children cannot go to segregated schools. Public schools have to be integrated. Black and white students have to go to school together. In practice, particularly in states throughout the South, this was not done right away. A lot of southern states, from the governor on down, openly stated their intention to defy the Supreme Court ruling. And this particularly came up in Little Rock in 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas, just right next door to us. So the Little Rock School Board, reading from the book now, had established a plan to gradually desegregate its schools, beginning with Central High School. 9 young African American students volunteered to enroll, but Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus announced his opposition to integration and called out the Arkansas State National Guard. When the 9 students arrived at Central High, the soldiers blocked their way. This is one of the huge defining moments in the American Civil Rights Movement, is the vision of the state governor flanked by National Guard troops blocking these 9 African American students from coming into Central High School. This was also something that was repeated in other states, particularly in Alabama. One of the 9, Elizabeth Eckford, has described the scene. An angry white mob began to approach her, with some screaming, "Lynch her, lynch her." Eckford sought out a friendly face, someone who might help. "I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face," she recalled. "But when I looked at her again, she spat on me." Unfortunately, another white woman whisked Eckford away on a public bus before the mob could have its way. None of the Little Rock 9 gained entrance to the school that day. Up until the Little Rock crisis, President Eisenhower had provided little leadership on the civil rights front. So Eisenhower is not going to be an active segregationist, but he's not really on board with the civil rights movement much. He doesn't want to be seen to be opposing it, but as the book points out, privately he expressed his misgivings about the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. He didn't really think that integrated schools were going to work. And so following the Brown decision, he did not urge the nation to rapidly desegregate its schools. But when Governor Faubus, again this is in Arkansas, resisted the will of the federal courts, Eisenhower realized he had to act. He sent federal troops to Little Rock to protect the students and to enforce the court's decision. Okay. Eisenhower is doing this not because he's decided that civil rights for African Americans is a good deal, but because these are the state's challenging the authority of the federal government, challenging the authority of the United States Supreme Court to set the law of the land. And Eisenhower realizes that if he lets these challenges from the states stand, that the power of the federal government is going to be eroded to the point where it's untenable. So he knows that he has to act here. For the entire school year, the federal troops stayed in Little Rock, escorting the 9 students to and from Central High and guarding them on the school grounds. On the last day of class, Ernest Green, the one senior of the 9, became the first African American to graduate from Central High School. The showdown demonstrated that the president would not tolerate open defiance of the law. Still, many southern states found ways to resist full compliance with the court's decision. Many years would pass before black and white children went to school together. Throughout this period, we have, with quite a number of southern states, championing of this idea of states' rights, that states should be free to run their schools as they see fit, including the idea of having them be segregated. So this is a concept, again, this is federalism. This goes right back to the federalism issue that is playing out today in a different forum concerning the COVID-19 shutdown. A lot of states around the country, most states around the country, have imposed lockdowns or quarantines on their residents. And the federal government, under President Trump, wants to reopen the economy as quickly as possible, get things flowing again so that the economic downturn doesn't last as long. So we've got this issue of states' rights. Does the president, under a federalist system like we have the authority to just open up these states where governors have said, no, you need to stay home, we're not allowing restaurants to just open and operate as normal? But in the 50s and 60s, the states' rights issue had to do with the desegregation of schools and whether or not people like Orville Faubus in Arkansas could keep the schools segregated. Okay, so then the civil rights movement protests move on to public transit. This is going to start in Montgomery, Alabama. In addition to legal efforts during this era, some civil rights activists took direct action to end segregation. Now remember our guiding questions for this week concerning nonviolent disobedience. Direct action in this case is going to be nonviolent disobedience, in which you're not trying to harm someone, but you are in the process of breaking an unjust law or a law that you deem to be unjust. Think about that when you are completing your assignment for the rest of the week, concerning nonviolent disobedience, which is going to be coming up with your own definition. What does civil disobedience or nonviolent disobedience mean to you? Put that in your own words. Okay, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress, boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat down in an empty seat. Several stops later, the bus driver requested that she give up her seat to a white passenger. This was according to Alabama law at the time. Montgomery, not Alabama, required African-American passengers to give up their seats to whites. After Rosa Parks refused to obey the law, she was arrested. The policeman asked if the driver had asked me to stand up, and I said yes, and they wanted to know why I didn't, Parks later recalled. I told them I didn't think I should have to stand up. After I had paid my fare and occupied a seat, I didn't think I should have to give it up. Parks's actions set in motion a chain of events that transformed the civil rights movement. Over the next few days, a corps of civil rights activists in Montgomery organized a one-day bus boycott. They called upon the black community to refuse to ride the buses as a way to express their opposition to Parks's arrest in particular, and segregation in general. Meanwhile, during the Montgomery bus boycott, the NAACP began preparing a legal challenge. This is really going to be where we first see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. rise to prominence with the Montgomery bus boycott. For a long while, many people thought that Parks had refused to give up her seat simply because she was tired after a long day of work. But in reality, Parks had a record of fighting for civil rights. She had been active in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP for years. This does not mean that she set out to get arrested and spark a movement, but Parks and other activists welcomed the chance to use the incident to protest bus segregation. This is the idea behind civil disobedience or nonviolent disobedience, is to to refuse to obey a law that you consider to be unjust and to take the punishment for it. I believe earlier this year we read some of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. This is where he had wound up after defying segregationist Jim Crow laws, was put in jail for it. But that fact that he was put in jail for nonviolent civil disobedience was one of the things that was a really powerful weapon, on the side of the civil rights protesters, because it showed to the world, hey, here's this, this person, whether it be Rosa Parks or Dr. King or whoever, who has been imprisoned, or say in the case of John Lewis in Selma, Alabama in the 60s, been beaten nearly to death, simply because they want to attain the civil rights that are due to them as an American citizen. And it's this public opinion pressure that's really the big weapon behind the civil rights movement. Okay, on the evening following the boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that sponsored the bus boycott, held a meeting. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, addressed the group. Though he had little time to prepare, King delivered an inspirational speech that brought the audience to its feet. Noting that African Americans were tired of segregation and oppression, King declared that there was no alternative but to protest. However, he called for the protests to be nonviolent. He urged them not to become resentful, which would lead to hatred toward whites, but rather to follow Christian doctrine and love them. After King spoke, the MIA, this is the Montgomery Improvement Association, vowed to continue the boycott and chose King as its leader. For more than a year, African Americans in Montgomery maintained their boycott of the buses. They did so despite economic pressures from their employers and threats of violence from the Ku Klux Klan. King himself survived a bombing of his house. Fortunately, his wife and baby daughter were not home at the time. That daughter, by the way, Bernice King, is alive and very active on Twitter. I follow her on Twitter, in fact. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that the Montgomery city law that segregated buses was unconstitutional. After more than a year, the MIA ended its boycott, and African Americans began to ride the buses again. So it's this pressure. You start with nonviolent protest, jailings or arrests or fines, but then that gives a group like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the MIA the opening to file suit in order to get an unjust law overturned. And this is going to be the ongoing story of the civil rights movement. Okay. We're not going to talk so much today about the sit-ins. We'll hit that probably tomorrow or next week. But particularly, I wanted to talk about the freedom rides. This is going to be in 1961. Going from the book, the next battleground was interstate transportation. And interstate transportation just means going from one state to another. And at the time, the early 1960s, most people, if they wanted to travel to a different state, weren't going to be hopping on an airplane. Passenger air travel was certainly a thing by then, but it wasn't something that was going to be as commonly done as riding a bus. So if you were in Oklahoma and you wanted to get to Nebraska or whatever, you were a lot more likely to hop on a Greyhound. And those interstate buses were, again, segregated during the Jim Crow era. Activists targeted this industry because they knew that travel between states was subject to federal rather than state regulation. And again, this is something that the Constitution is going to come into play with, because the Constitution gives the federal government the right to regulate interstate commerce, which includes travel. The protesters against segregation knew that they were going to have an easier time with the federal government than they were with, say, the state government of Mississippi, which was very heavily invested in segregation, as were all southern state governments, basically. But they knew they had a better chance with the federal government, the national government centered in Washington, D.C., as far as overturning these laws of segregation. And so that's why they targeted interstate commerce, because that would be a federal issue, not a state issue. In fact, the Supreme Court had recently ruled in Boynton versus Virginia in 1960 that segregation on interstate buses and in waiting rooms was illegal. Civil rights activists were now going to test the federal government's willingness to enforce the law. This is what we saw with Eisenhower. You get the Supreme Court making a decision, but then it's got to be enforced, or the law is just a dead letter. The Supreme Court obviously can't, send troops out to enforce the law. That is incumbent upon the executive branch of the government, headed by the president. And it took Eisenhower quite a bit of time to realize, okay, I guess I better go enforce this. So now, with the Freedom Rides coming up in 1961, the protesters are going to test the federal government's willingness to back up this Supreme Court ruling again from 1960 that required the integration, of interstate bus travel. In the spring of 1961, CORE, I forget now what CORE is an acronym for. Anyway, staged a freedom ride through the Deep South. Riders set off in 2 separate buses from Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. En route, they defied segregationist codes. African Americans sat in the front of the bus and used white restrooms in bus stations. In Alabama, the trip took a dangerous turn. After departing from Anniston, pro-segregationists firebombed one of the buses. When the second bus arrived in Birmingham, a white mob attacked the riders. So President Kennedy's in the White House by this time. Eisenhower's gone. Kennedy is going to take a little bit more active role in this, but he is also wary of angering white Democrats in the South at this point too much. So he isn't as active as one might have expected him to be. Photographs of the bombed-out bus and the injured riders appeared in newspapers and on television screens around the world, prodding President John F. Kennedy to intervene. Here's that mass media impact again. Kennedy had intervened before. The previous year, when he was running for the presidency, Kennedy had helped to win Martin Luther King's release from a Georgia prison after state officials had sentenced King to 6 months in jail for a traffic violation. King was freed, and Kennedy, with the help of African American voters, went on to win the presidential election of 1960. Kennedy now took action to stem the violence against the Freedom Riders. His administration worked out a deal with Mississippi's leaders. Police and state troopers agreed to protect the riders. The Federal Transportation Commission also issued an order mandating the desegregation of interstate transportation. In exchange, the Kennedy administration agreed not to intervene when Mississippi authorities arrested the activists and sentenced them to jail for disturbing the peace. Okay. Again, though, this is nonviolent civil protest, even when pro-segregationists are firebombing buses, attacking the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders are not becoming violent in return. Freedom Riders achieved their immediate goal. They compelled a reluctant federal government to act by refusing to allow violent mobs to deter them. The riders also displayed that intimidation would not defeat the movement. Okay, so I've got a couple of quotes for you today. First one from Henry David Thoreau. If the machine of government is of such as nature that it requires you to be of injustice to another, then I say break the law. In other words, if government has a law that, in order to follow that law, requires that you be unjust to another person, then break the law. The other from Dr. King himself. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This is the guiding idea, the guiding philosophy behind the civil rights movement. So here's what I want you to work on between now and Friday. Based on these quotes, what we've learned about the civil rights movement and the photos in the Calculated Acts document, begin coming up with your own definition of civil disobedience. What does, in your words, civil disobedience mean? I want more than 3 words, please. A couple of sentences would be great. This is going to be due on Friday, along with our Zoom meeting and your weekly journal entry. Okay? Talk to you guys later.